Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines and take a practitioner's take on national security and geopolitics. It is the 15th of December, 2023. Let's dive in. Now, today we're going to be looking at one of the most interesting areas of our competition with China, our main geopolitical rival. And that's the area of competition surrounding technology, specifically 5G and telecommunications. Now, this is an industry that America and her allies created from the ground up. We invented this stuff. And we've found ourselves in a situation where China, our main foreign competitor, has dominated the industry globally. Now, this has massive ramifications from a security standpoint, because telecommunications is one of those technologies that runs in the background of everything we do, and it's a key enabler for all sorts of other innovations that we see. Innovations in security, innovations in healthcare, innovation in how factories run. It touches everything. And because it touches everything, who controls it and where it comes from has significant implications when nations go to compete with each other, either economically, militarily, or otherwise. So today we are going to deep dive this issue with a true expert in the area, a man named Jon Pelson. Jon is a former telecommunications executive. He worked at Lucent Technologies in the 90s. He worked at British Telecom. He has seen the telecommunications industry evolve through multiple generations. And he started an investigation into how China came to dominate this industry that America created. And what he found was very remarkable, and he documents it very well in a book called Wireless Wars. The link will be in the show notes. So wanted to sit down and talk with Jon about what 5G is and why it's such a critical technology, how it affects our national security, how China has come to dominate this technology, and look at what strategies America could pursue to regain our lead and secure our infrastructure in this critical area. With that, let's go to Jon.
Excellent.
Yep. All right, and I think we're live. Sweet. Well, Jon, thanks for hopping on this morning. Welcome to the podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's really nice to be here with you, Scott.
Yeah. Super excited to have this conversation. It's nice to see you again, albeit virtually, since the last time I got to bump into you in DC. But you wrote a very interesting book called Wireless Wars that goes through our competition with China around this technology called 5G. So I was wondering if you could briefly introduce yourself and explain your background real quick for the audience, and then also just tell us why is 5G important, and then we'll start getting into what our issues with China are.
Sure. So my name is Jon Pelson. I started out my career, well, I'd just say most of my career was spent as a telecom exec, generally on wireless cutting edge technology, working with Lucent's Bell Labs and British Telecom, Nextel. And I decided a couple of years ago to write a book that was supposed to be a business book about how Huawei and ZTE in China were able to effectively put out of business the companies that invented cellular, Motorola, Bell Labs, Nortel. And early on, when I was doing my research for Wireless Wars, I ran into, just through dumb luck, a counter-intel officer at the FBI. And he said, well, where is Huawei putting its cell gear in the U.S.? I said, they can barely sell anything in this country. They sell to mom and pop providers in rural America, Montana, and North Dakota. And he said, well, what's out there? I said, I've been there. Montana's beautiful, but there's not much out there. He said, no, it's all of our nuclear missile bases, Special Operations Command, the nuclear subbase. They're all being served by Huawei Chinese-made networks. And I found that incredible because, as I said, I made a career in the industry. I never heard about this. Mm-hmm. And of course, it turned out it was true. So the book that I wrote turned from a business book to a geopolitical book about national security, technology, and how America can compete against what we considered a trading partner, but a country that sees us as a geopolitical rival for power. And in my opinion, it got a lot more interesting with that when you brought in the national security and the and kind of the non-kinetic war. When I named it wireless wars, my point wasn't that this wireless business competition is almost as fierce as a war. My point was that this is a war that China is waging against us, just being fought through non-kinetic means. And the reason 5G is so important, I quote Jessica Rosenworcel, who was at the time a commissioner in the FCC and is now the chairwoman. She said, if we get 5G right, the handset and the smartphone will be the least interesting thing about it. And she's right. 5G is not faster 4G. And part of the confusion is that all the companies advertise it's fast 4G, and that's not what's good. If you've ever had a great signal on your 4G smartphone and you're getting 40 megabits per second, I've never heard anyone groan and say, if only I could get 120 megabits per second, that would really be a good experience, because you can already do multiple HD video streams at once. What 5G is about is connecting the world, Internet of Things, so that your factory operates efficiently, your port works differently, municipal systems, traffic lights, sensors all operate well, that farms can operate with better soil sensors and geolocation devices for the tractors. You have factories today that have thousands of sensors deployed. They're generally wired because you need low latency, you need high reliability. Wi-Fi doesn't do that. And 4G can handle hundreds of connections. 5G in a factory can handle the thousands and thousands of simultaneous connections that you need. So that's what 5G is really about. It's about controlling industry, commerce, day-to-day life, national security. That all is going to be relying in the coming years on a 5G network that's trusted and reliable and works well.
And so I guess the threat there then is that if China is the leader in 5G technology and they're sourcing 5G at a better competitive price and we're putting their stuff into all of our 5G networks, they'd now have access to all of our intellectual property and all our metadata across all industries everywhere.
Exactly. You know, people say, well, China can hack a Nokia network. Couldn't China hack a network that's built in the United States by the handful of companies that are still able to make high-end wireless communications equipment? And the answer is a state-motivated agent is capable of hacking anything. You know, I didn't even touch in the book, but the U.S. hacked the Huawei core switch years ago. It was called Operation Shot Giant. I couldn't get anyone from the CIA or the NSA to go on record talking about it, but we got into their source code when they were deploying their networks in North Korea. We were listening. So the idea that China can do that through any other network is true, but the point is, if you're at least building it with a trusted supplier, you're fighting the fight. There's countermeasures. You can stop them and let them have to work hard to get any tiny bit of information before you stop that too. If you're buying the system, it's kind of like you've told your landlord, put in a really good lock so I can't get burglarized. That's not a 100% guarantee. But if you're worried about your landlord robbing you, he has the key. And building a Huawei, putting out a Huawei network in your country is basically handing the key over to someone that considers you an enemy. And that's, I think, how China sees us now.
Yeah. Well, and we look at the other large-scale sources of wireless technology right now. It's basically Ericsson and Nokia. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the U.S. to try to correct that and bring American manufacturing back here. But if you're living in a world where your choices are some form of foreign network running everything in your country, what is it about the Chinese Communist Party and the way that they approach their business relationships with their companies that makes it so much more dangerous to go with a Huawei versus an Ericsson or Nokia?
Well, so Ericsson and Nokia, you got a Swedish and a Finnish country there, and these are allies in the process, in fact, of becoming NATO allies. Now, they have different views still towards the world. China now owns Volvo. I'd like to think the U.S. would fight to keep China from owning General Motors. China owns an awful lot of Mercedes now. So, you know, you've got trusted allies, but there's nothing that you can trust as much as your own systems that are under your own control. So the concern with the way the government in China works is that the Chinese Communist Party is above the Constitution. There's a Constitution in China. There's laws in China. They are applied unevenly, but they exist. The Communist Party is not subject to them. So when they tell a company, first of all, they passed laws, the Intelligence Act, that said you have to cooperate in any matter that affects national security. And they've now started to tweak it. So it's not national security, it's any national interest.
Yeah.
So you have companies that Huawei is not owned by Huawei is controlled by the government. People say it's a private company. And I did, in Wireless Wars, I researched the ownership. They're owned by the employees. Okay, so the employees have representatives on the board? Well, no, the union is the voice of the employees on the board. Okay, but the union answers to the employees, right? Well, in the West, it does. In China, the union answers to the senior union, who answers to the more senior union, who answers to the political controllers in the Chinese Communist Party. So the Communist Party controls the board of Huawei. That's all you need to know about how much you can or can't trust them to be an agent of the country.
Okay. Well, if there are all these concerns here, how has Huawei and ZTE been able to expand themselves all over Africa? They were in Europe. They were making massive inroads into the U.S. I mean, why did we have these blinders on when we started doing business with these folks?
Well, here's the problem. First of all, Huawei makes a great 5G network. It's better. Their polar codes, their technology is better throughput, higher quality. It's much cheaper. And by the way, it's not cheaper because it's made in China.
Mm-hmm.
All the systems are made in China. Nokia, Ericsson, their factories are down the road. They're hiring the same workers, using the same inputs. So you say, how is Huawei so much cheaper? Well, one of the answers to that is the country has subsidized Huawei to the tune of more than $75 billion, according to Wall Street Journal analysis. And if you're getting $75 billion poured in, you can start pricing at a fraction of your cost even, and still be able to appear to be making a profit and have money for reinvestment and R&D. And just by comparison, Cisco, who's a national champion for global network equipment, has also been subsidized by the U.S. government, roughly $45 million over the period that Huawei got $75 billion with a B. So it's a night and day what's happening there. And knowing that they're making these good systems. Now, also keep in mind, Huawei did not come up with the breakthrough brilliance that made 5G better than the others. It was a Turkish mathematician who came up with it. Nokia wasn't interested. Ericsson passed. They already have their own scientists. They don't need any help from some Turkish mathematician. Huawei took this and said, you've solved something that brings us closer to the limit. It's called Shannon's limit, which is the absolute theoretical maximum for a wireless network. And they gave him a plaque in return for him sharing the IP with them. So he was delighted. He was delighted to get this plaque presented by Ron Zhengfei, the chairman of Huawei. He could have charged them if he said, I want $1 billion cash right now. I think they would have paid it.
Dang. Wow. That's I didn't know that story. That's amazing. Well, perhaps you could walk us through, how is it that, other than maybe it's just this one Turkish guy, but we invented cellular technology here in the US, and now Huawei is building the best 5G networks in the world. How did we get to this point where we're basically getting our ass kicked in a field that we started by a foreign competitor who wants to use it to undermine our national security?
When we went into China to start making this stuff cheaply, the first factories that talk about this were refurbishing first generation wireless. So when we came out with second generation digital cellular, because Bell Labs invented this, Motorola and Nortel were also at the cutting edge. But when we came out with the digital version, 2G wireless, instead of throwing away the cell tower equipment, the stuff that's at the base of all these towers along the highway, the switches and radios, we shipped them to China and refurbished them in joint venture factories. That was the beginning. And you can say, and they demanded technology sharing, which for anyone in the technology business, that's not actually a thing. There's no technology sharing, there's technology ownership. Mm-hmm. But think about this, intellectual property, you own the property. If you're a communist nation, the idea of property ownership, intellectual or otherwise, it's not really sacrosanct in China. So you wonder, why do they steal so much IP? They steal, some estimates, more than $400 billion a year from the U.S. are stolen by China. It's because if you don't believe property can be owned anyway, it belongs to whoever can put their hands on it. So that is part of the problem is when all the Western companies, and I shouldn't say Western, Samsung, other companies in Asia, Japan and Korea, all moved manufacturing to China for cheap labor, cheap R&D, really smart people, and huge markets. What happened was either through voluntary sharing or through theft, when you're on location like that, the intellectual property was stolen, and Huawei was able to combine really smart management, really aggressive leadership at the company with kind of the force multiplier was they could leapfrog 5 years of R&D by stealing it and just rolling it out as their own. And multiple cases. I mean, Cisco had one of the best cases when they demonstrated the theft of their IP. They said your brochure, your manual that accompanies the Huawei switch has the same typos that the Cisco manual has. Your code has comments. You see some
incredible.
supposedly, it's a Beijing coder who's typing, "This is gnarly, dude, but I figured out a way to solve this." You're like, I think that guy's in San Jose. That's just me, but it does not sound like a guy, commenting like that. And when the general counsel for Cisco met Ron Zhengfei, the chairman of Huawei, and said, "You've got the same typos," he said, "It's a coincidence. Get out of here." We wrote that manual ourselves. So how do you beat that? That force multiplier of smart people, smart engineers with stolen IP is a winning formula.
So is there any recourse for a company like Nokia to actually go in there and then fight the Chinese Communist Party or fight Huawei and ZTE? Like, you find this, they're clearly copying all your stuff. What are your options as a company?
Yeah, you're pretty limited. When Sweden decided to block Huawei from deploying any equipment in Sweden, Ericsson, who's the economic engine of Sweden, warned the government not to block Huawei because China said, if you block us in Sweden, we're going to block you in China, where Ericsson sells more gear in China than they do in their home country of Sweden, which sounds odd until you think about the sizes of the countries. Mm-hmm. Ericsson threatened, according to credible reports, to pull the company out of Sweden if the country was hard on Huawei. Think about the leverage they must have over even their own national champion. So there's very little these companies can do to the government. In fact, I told a story about how three spies were caught stealing source code at Lucent from Bell Labs, something called the PathStar switch. And one of them fled back to China. The other two were held. And the chairwoman of Lucent, Pet Russo, went over there and met with the Chinese authorities. They said, "We don't know who those people are that stole it. We have nothing to do with this. And if you prosecute them, we're buying nothing for the next year from you." So that's kind of an odd response to, given that you don't know who these people are and you have nothing to do with them. And she said, "It would have cost my struggling company more than $600 million to prosecute two junior engineers." And so we waived our participation. They were fined and let go.
Dang. So let's take this angle then. This does not sound like open competition amongst private entities in a free-flowing global market, because an argument you'll hear all the time is just, well, this is the free market at work. We live in a globalized world right now. There's even the theories out there that, democracy follows free trade. So the more trade we have with China, not only are they going to become more democratic over time, but the less likely we are to get into a shooting war with them. Not a lot of evidence showing either one of those things is playing out. But what is the role of the U.S. government in all this then, in protecting our intellectual property and preventing this theft of technologies that we're developing that have massive implications? And even how do we partner with the Ericssons and Nokias of the world and their host countries to help them stand up to China? Because clearly they're not in a position to do it on their own.
If you take a liberal worldview, and I mean liberal with a capital L, meaning liberty and freedom and exchanges of goods, then we're all in this together. Trade leads to peace. If you have extensive international trading relationships with other countries, that has always been a method to lead to peace. If a country makes all of your insulin, you're not likely to bomb that country. because you'll have your own problem. If you're supplying all of your wheat, or your major customer of your wheat is another country, you're not likely to go to war and stop them from buying it. It just leads to peaceful relations. But that assumes this liberal worldview that everyone's in this together. You may be competitors, you may be customers, you may be partners, you may even be competitors, but you're all just trying to get ahead. And the measure for success in that liberal worldview for trade is absolute. What I mean by that is, if you do a transaction, if you buy something or sell something and you come out ahead, you don't care how the other guy did. That's his problem. If they want to subsidize something and sell it to you, that's just a tax on their own citizens and a gift to your citizens. Take it. Even if they're selling it to you below cost, just buy it from them. Why spend $100 to make a box that you can buy complete for $40 and you have $60 left over to buy something else too? But that assumes that China is in this, they just want to be wealthy, they want to be happy. If it's war, the measure is not absolute, it's relative, meaning when you're looking at someone as a rival, as an enemy, you're not trying to get richer, you're trying to get better off compared to them, which means you'll get poorer. You spend $1 million on a bomb, but you drop it on their tank, and so you're out $1 million, but they're out $10 million. You win, even though you're poorer now. If China sees it like that, they're subsidizing these companies to get power and influence in the world, knowing that China will become poorer for it, but they'll become more powerful. That is a war metric, not a liberal world trade metric. And that's what's going on there. So our government has to look at this not as I'm a free trader all the way, but this isn't trade. This is geopolitical rivalry that's at play here.
That's a wonderful way to frame it from a mindset perspective. There's one of my favorite stories from your book actually involves the African Union headquarters that China built for the African Union. Major diplomatic move, lots of goodwill, and access to the right people in the right places on a very important continent. Perhaps you could walk us through this wonderful gift that China gave the African Union for their headquarters in order to build diplomacy and unity on the continent of Africa and all the goodwill they got from that.
Yeah, in the spirit of harmony and support for the African people, China spent $250 million to put up this beautiful complex in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. That would be the center of military, political, and business activity for the continent of Africa, which I don't know if China was aware is a great source for cobalt, lithium, all sorts of other rare earth metals and other precious materials.
Well, isn't that nice?
Yeah, they probably didn't even know when they insinuated themselves to them, but they built it.
Sometimes good things happen to good people.
Exactly. So they built it. They also were kind enough to equip the data centers, all Huawei servers, and years later, someone discovered that the power consumption was surging in the middle of the night when no one was really there using the center. What was happening is the servers were turning on and uploading all the military, political, and business information to Shenzhen. So they went in there, they ripped out all the gear. I believe they replaced it with Cisco. That part has not been made public. No one really commented. They didn't want to acknowledge it. China denied that they were involved in anything like this. But a couple years later, they realized that the security systems, the cameras and so on, were still feeding live video and audio back to China, and there were listening devices throughout the conference room. So that all had to get ripped out and also replaced. And the sad thing, Scott, is later that same year, this is about 3 years ago now, they decided to build a CDC in Addis Ababa. I guess closer to 2 or 3 years ago now.
That's Center for Disease Control?
Centers for Disease Control, because of the pandemic and other issues, they really needed to step up their game, they decided, in Africa. And China won the rights to build that center too. So China will now be building that facility just down the road from the African Union headquarters. So there's no lessons learned, or maybe the lessons were learned, but there may be influence that's being exerted on the people that get to make these decisions.
Dang. So yeah, having them run our entire network here in the U.S. would probably be a bad thing, or having them, do our Internet of Things architecture and all of our factories, probably not the best thing for our long-term security interests.
Yeah, putting their cell towers around our nuclear missile bases is a bad idea. And unfortunately, they're still mostly in place right now.
Oh, you got to be kidding me. We haven't taken those out?
Congress found out, and they funded the rip and replace of the Huawei gear. Nuclear missile bases, special operations command, all served in America. By Huawei gear. Malmstrom has been replaced. In fact, I believe with an OpenRAN elements, but they're stalled on replacing the other stuff. So it's still mostly Huawei in our most sensitive military locations in the U.S.
Dang, that's a little heartbreaking and also comical.
Yes.
I'm not sure how I feel. Well, I know how I feel about that, but you brought up an interesting thing there too with OpenRAN. One of the things that people should understand about these telecommunications networks is that they're extremely complicated and you cannot swap components between them hardly ever. An Ericsson network can't be upgraded with Nokia equipment. Huawei can't be swapped with ZTE, even those places where they've basically copied the intellectual property. So when you hire somebody to go put in a network, you're hiring them to do the whole thing. So vendor lock is a huge issue. One of the most interesting evolutions in this ecosystem, though, is the move to an ORAN architecture, where theoretically there'll be a set of standards that everyone can build equipment to so you can swap stuff in and out. So we can go from this model from where, if you're building a house, it's all lumber cut on site and highly skilled labor and everything else, to you can just go buy a pallet of 2x4s and ship it anywhere and start slapping things together. Perhaps you could talk us a little bit about what ORAN would mean in this context.
Well, I argued in Wireless Wars for the alternatives to the, I'll use the term hegemony of Huawei. I mean, they are the dominant force in global telecommunications networks.
Aren't they like 80% or something of the global, some ridiculous number?
Yeah, it's huge. Huawei sells more gear than all the biggest players combined, than Ericsson and Nokia multiple times over. Even today, with the bans in place, they're still by far the biggest. And what I argued for was not trying to out Huawei, out China by saying, we even had a suggestion, I think it was Attorney General Barr at the time, who had been the Verizon general counsel at one point in his career, said, let's put $10 billion into Ericsson or Nokia so that they can do much more R&D, come up with better stuff, and compete with Huawei. First of all, that would have made him closer to, but still a fraction of the size of Huawei in terms of R&D. But second of all, China is much better at command and control, put all your wood behind one arrow and do a massive coordinated effort. If that's how we're playing it, we're playing their game and we will lose. America's strength is in trusted ecosystems of highly competitive, innovative companies. That's what's made America the world's biggest economy. I talked in the book about American exceptionalism, which my editor almost had fell out of her chair. But I said, no, look at the examples I'm giving. About half of them weren't born in America. American exceptionalism means you come to America and you have a system that is more amenable to innovation, disruption. And think about if you come up with a solution, I used the term that I had come across, permissionless innovation, where you say, I'm going to let people rent other people's houses for the night. So, well, you're breaking all these conventions. Normally you would never let a stranger in your house. Legally, you're not zoned as a hotel. Yet Airbnb came along and disrupted the hotel market, really did a lot of harm to it, but created, billions, hundreds of billions in value between Airbnb, Uber. Strangers will pick you up in their own cars. You got a taxi industry that didn't like this. In America, you can do that. It's against cultural values. It's against the law, but you can face the government in court and you can win. And that's what happened. The government sued Uber. The government sued, they went after all these companies and the companies won. Not every time, but they won. In China, if you say I'm going to take out this entire revered Chinese industry with my clever breakthrough innovation, there's no patience for that. There's no interest in that. Even, if you're Jack Ma, the richest man in China, the founder of Alibaba, he gave one speech following a Chinese minister where he countered the minister saying, you can't regulate a digital bank the way you regulate bricks and mortar bank. And that was the end of Jack Ma. They shut down his IPO. They closed his business school for entrepreneurs. They effectively took him out as a force of innovation in China. I estimate close to $1 trillion cost to China. And I think if they had it to do again, they would. So that's a long way, Scott. You asked me about OpenRAN. I say, how do you respond then to this massive scale-based winner, Huawei? And the answer is you go to not corporate scale, but market scale. So if you open up the interfaces between elements of a telecom network so that anyone can drop their hardware or software in, and it still has to be accepted and interoperate, suddenly, instead of having one big company or a different big company, you have all companies. You can have some Caltech junior working in his or her dorm room say, I've written a better piece of code for handing off phone calls between adjacent cell sites. And you can drop it into the network, see if it works. Today, that's a fantasy. You can't add your own software to Nokia. It is what it is. And I can give you an analogy of how this brings value. If you take a car. If you ever cracked or damaged a dashboard in your Toyota, putting a new plastic dashboard in could cost you $2,000. And that's just a piece of molded plastic because there's only one dashboard and it's got to be from Toyota. But putting 4 tires on, which are much more sophisticated engineering and construction, you could do it for $100 each because anyone can make a tire that goes on a Toyota. The interface is open to anyone that wants to compete. And that's why Bluetooth, you can spend $300 for some earpod Bluetooth headphones, or you can spend $9 for a no-name because they all have the same interface. It's open. Now, each company has its own proprietary technology, but in an open system, what matters then is trust, invention, cleverness, and the scale of the entire industry. If you can have any company, and even companies like Dell or HP or Cisco can make telecom equipment, well, you've allowed giants in, you've allowed startups in, you've allowed individuals in. And that's how you can beat China playing at our game, not their game.
So how do we get to that point? Because that sounds great. And yeah, it's definitely better than trying to out-China China. But just looking at the telecom industry, how do you go to these legacy vendors and tell them, hey, you need to play with this new ORAN alliance or ORAN standards, or you need to change how you're doing business here? And how do you then go fund all these startups to come in and start nibbling away at that? It seems like there's a massive gulf between where we live today and what that bright, shiny future would look like. NTIA's got like $1.5 billion in ORAN funding that they're trying to give out, which is a drop in the bucket compared to the size of the problem we're trying to address. So you're a smart guy. You've been around this industry. You know how the government thinks. If you could wave the magic wand and lay out the path to get there, what steps do we need to be taking?
Well, I met with people at Department of Commerce early on after the book came out, and the advice I gave was there's not enough money for you to spend that it can't all be wasted with nothing to show for it. So $1.5 billion for 5G, $30 billion for wireless, $250 billion for the whole CHIPS Act. That sounds like a lot of money, and it is in a way. But in the big picture, if you're picking winners and trying to force the money into, as I put it, if you're trying to roll a rock uphill, so you got a lot of people helping, as soon as you stop pushing on it, as soon as that money goes away, that rock is rolling right back down that hill again.
Yeah.
So what you have to find, and this was the way I counseled the government on this, either you find a rock that's on a downslope but needs a push to get rolling, and then it'll have its own positive business case that it can go with, or even find a rock that's rolling uphill but is near a peak, and if you can get them up and over that, then they're a competitive company. The example I would give there is a lot of the equipment for OpenRAN vendors, the cost is all in the chip, and the cost of the chip is determined by volume. So if you say we're making 1,000 of these, they're going to say, all right, the chips are going to be $3,000 each. But if you made 1 million of them, it would drop down to $300 each. Okay, well, we're never going to sell any products with that thousands of dollars per chip. But if the government helped us get up to a higher volume because our product is so good, this OpenRAN solution, then we're at that $300 chip volume, and we're actually competitive in the space, and we'll take it from there. So that's one of the possible ways. I hate the idea of government handouts to private industry, but we're competing against Chinese companies that are not just private industry. They really are And as I said, they're not just, subsidizing us. They're not just dumping, giving us cheap products, which is great. This is done with an intent to infiltrate and really weaken other countries. So we have to step up like it's more of a war footing than just a plain business footing.
That is, I think about my friends who still work in government and the way we were all taught to think and raised. The way you're discussing this being a war footing, that is a mindset that people will readily adopt. But looking at the structure of the government, I'm not even sure what institutions in the government can effectively drive this forward. I mean, Commerce is one, NTIA is one, DoD is a player, but the U.S. government, it's almost purpose built to not be able to effectively employ industrial policy as a tool of national security. And not to throw up my hands in the air and say we're screwed, but it's hard to imagine who we need to get in the room and what laws need to be passed just to allow us to compete effectively with this without also creating the same beast that we're trying to slay here in America.
Scott, you're putting your finger on, I think, the biggest problem with our response. And China, by the way, is intimately aware of this and masterful at playing our system. Think about which institutions are charged with securing America against enemies. So, what do you got? The Pentagon, the DoD, the intelligence community, NSA, CIA, FBI, Treasury, sort of. But when you slide all the way over to the Department of Commerce, look at their website, look at their mandate. Their job is, and I'll paraphrase here, to create jobs in America and encourage the growth of commercial activity. So you take Gina Raimondo, in my opinion, I think the best person in the cabinet, smartest, most focused, committed, best experienced. She has that as her mandate. And now for her to go to companies and say, all right, I want to encourage commercial success among you American companies, but you can't buy your inputs from the cheapest, best source of inputs. Yep. Oh, and also you can't sell your outputs to the biggest market for them. Qualcomm, you can't sell any more chips to Huawei. They're saying, well, we're supplying the Pentagon with a lot of chips. The Pentagon wants a healthy supplier, and you've just crippled us.
Yep.
And they're right. So what does she do? What does Commerce do? What they've basically been doing is kind of bending, because their mandate is not to secure America. Their mandate is to encourage commerce. And yet they're primarily charged with fighting this fight. And I think that is untenable. I don't think it's going to work as long as that's the model.
Dang. Well, there's a bunch of cynical follow-ups to that. But so we're saying, okay, so ORAN can get us out of this. But to get to ORAN, we need secure sources of chips at scale. So we need probably government funding to get companies to do that. And we have to rearrange global supply chains and capital flows and markets just to start pushing the rock maybe over the first molehill and try to roll it down a mountain eventually.
Exactly. You think about it, there's no simple fix. There's no quick fix. What has to happen is a long series of actions, some of which will not work out, hopefully some of which will. And eventually you'll create this dynamic ecosystem that rises to the occasion. You get scale, not from the company, but from the entire market, that there's 200,000 researchers working on the radio system, not at one company, but maybe at 1,000 companies. Maybe you've got Cisco, you've got SAP or Intel that's contributing their own researchers to this in a better model, and you got to hang in there because it's going to be tough. You're going to be spending more money, which we're already doing by not buying Huawei. That's a tax on our people because you could put in a better, cheaper system if you just sucked it up. And I understand, by the way, that Germany, the buzz is that they're now saying, you know what, we're going to stick with Huawei. It's just too expensive with our budget crunch to replace that gear. And I haven't seen final formal confirmation of that, but it's definitely what I'm hearing now is Germany has quietly decided to stick with Huawei.
Well, if we've got NATO allies, especially major NATO allies like Germany using Huawei equipment, the implications for information sharing, formally and informally, I mean, that's, without firing a shot, that cripples our ability to communicate military to military in the largest military alliance and most successful deterrent force on the face of the planet. and not a shot has been fired.
That's how China plans on winning without firing a shot. They know that a kinetic war against the U.S. would be ugly for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
20 years ago, we would have won handily. Now, I don't think we would. What people tell me that do the war gaming is we wouldn't win a kinetic war. I don't know that China would win. It would just be ugly.
Mm-hmm.
They want to win without fighting. It's always been the philosophy. Sun Tzu and prior, and we're well into this podcast without the mentioning of Sun Tzu. So I've just violated. I think it's called Mulvanen's law. How many slides into a deck in DC about China before you mention Sun Tzu?
Okay.
So
I got the Tao Te Ching over there on the bookshelf somewhere. I can pull that off and from freshman college course.
Right.
It seems like we've got a mismatch with how we approach national power and how we prioritize, the dime, the diplomacy, information, military, economic aspects of national power. We have basically outsourced information economics to the free market in America, and we don't even run that as a country anymore. We're big on M, and then we have a little bit of D just to smooth everything over. China's looking at this going, okay, our M is actually just a massive employment scheme to keep our young men occupied. We never actually want to use it. It's really just there to bump up our D, and we're going all in on information and economy because that's our one asymmetric advantage. If we just cheat the system and profit from everybody else's, generosity and democratic values.
Exactly. People, we want to be in this kumbaya moment that we're all trying to lift everyone up. And once China sees the benefits of free market economics, how are they going to keep their people down in political systems where there's no votes or ability to control your destiny? But the fact is, they were actually pretty good at doing just that. And so the hope that opening them up, as we brought them into the World Trade Organization 20 years ago now, everyone thought, I certainly thought, that this will lead to a liberalization of the people and a democracy. And people say we want to keep China down. Well, we don't want to keep Korea down. We don't want to keep Japan or Germany or the UK down. We want thriving competitors and customers and partners, and that's what we've gotten. I mean, we were in war with some of those countries not long ago, and they're allies now and partners. Mm-hmm. The hope is that that's what would happen with China, and that hasn't been the case. Their investments, they realize that when you put all that money into Huawei, the return is like our return on an aircraft carrier. We put $10 billion into an aircraft carrier. How much money are we going to make on it? Well, none, but we get strength and authority, influence over other countries. That's why we build the carriers. China's doing that through business. They realize that that's a better way to fight the fight and win the war.
Dang. Well, shoot, I'm not sure where to go from there.
Yeah, I would say that China's use of economic power also leaves them vulnerable, though. So we've got kind of this mutual assured destruction. Mm-hmm. If they invaded Taiwan, whether or not they could take it, people debate. Whether we would intervene militarily is a debate. But if we saw that, it would cause a decoupling, maybe even a complete decoupling, which would be devastating to the world. My argument is the U.S. would look like we did during the Great Depression, 20% unemployment, but China would look like they did during the years after the Cultural Revolution, when they had tens of millions of people starving to death. 500 million people would be plunged into abject poverty, and presumably they don't want that they know it would lead to political instability in their own country. So that's keeping China, I think, from acting overtly. But that's the issue.
Yeah, the consequences of economic collapse in China due to any number of factors would be catastrophic for everyone around the globe right now. Two follow-up questions to that, though. Does that mean we need to start driving economic decoupling now so we can build it on our own terms? Does that need to be the policy of the United States, is economic decoupling from China?
I think China has shown themselves to be untrustworthy as a supplier, mm-hmm. and we can't decouple right now. It's just we're too intertwined. But you talk about building chip plants in the U.S., chip fab plants, which are really hard to do and really hard to operate. If you've ever worked in a startup, people spend nights and weekends just hanging in there. And you say, well, why don't you just hire more people? You can't. You need continuity. You need someone who's working on something and stays on it till it's fixed. That's how the workers are at TSMC. Those factories, not just the leadership, but the employees are engaged, committed. They work extremely hard at all levels, and that's how the place works. We have to get people doing that in the U.S., and there are people that work like that, and we have to have enough of them work in these factories to make them operate, even if it's not economically favorable. You get back to the point of like an aircraft carrier. What's the payoff on it? Well, there is none. All right, so building a chip plant here, it may cost much more than if we just bought them from China, but it's a reliable source, and we pay a premium for it, and that's kind of what we have to do. I mean, World War II, we wouldn't have been buying our steel from Germany or Japan, even if it was better and cheaper. Mm-hmm. Because first of all, what if they turn it off, as you would expect? And second, it's hard to bomb their steel factories if that's what we use to build our bombers.
So that can be a problem.
We have to suck it up and onshore, or at least friend-shore, a lot of this technology. Go to Vietnam. You talk about the Chinese army. Last time the Chinese military was in a shooting war was in the 70s when they invaded Vietnam and they got their asses kicked.
Yeah.
So they haven't proved themselves to be great at that, but there's a lot of countries around there that have very low opinion of the Chinese Communist Party, and we can look to those countries as possible outsourcing of our technology.
Okay. Well, it's also a fun fact, too. I was surprised to learn this a couple of years ago. Mexico is now cheaper for labor than China is. People use the argument that, Chinese labor is so cheap. It's like, actually, right on our southern border, less expensive and a more skilled workforce. If you could just magically pick up the factories and drop them off there, we'd all be better for it.
That's right. And there's recourse. You're dealing with a troubled government in Mexico, but a government. In China, there's no recourse. There's no explanations. They seize people. They restrain them from leaving. Mm-hmm. They steal their intellectual property. And what do you do? Who do you complain to in China?
Yeah. Man. I'm just thinking through all the problems in my head. I'm trying to figure out how the U.S. government could effectively do anything to move the needle on this. And nothing comes to mind and nothing moves quickly with those folks. We have to rely on Congress to step in. That's a scary thought.
That is a scary thought. Well-intentioned as they may be, they're not demonstrating themselves to be a terribly effective group right now.
No, and foresight's not really their forte. So responding to crises, but how do you get ahead of the crises so we don't have to respond to it? We can preempt it. That's rough.
Well, it's you look at what's happening with OpenRAN, which is I reference kind of the payoff of the book is how do you respond, and it's on trust-based ecosystems in free countries, not in the West. I'm very careful about that. Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Europe, U.S., Africa, South America, these are all places that can work in a trusted ecosystem. OpenRAN requires that. Requires trust and interoperability and things that China's not great at. And you asked a question, I don't think I really answered it when you talked about the big companies moving into OpenRAN, because there was the announcement recently that AT&T was going to switch from Nokia to Ericsson and go with OpenRAN. Now,
that doesn't sound like OpenRAN, but yeah.
Well, so, who's the winner there? What is the real implication? The only thing you can tell for sure is that this is bad for Nokia because they won't be the vendor anymore, at least to the extent that it's moved. Is Ericsson really going to be providing OpenRAN systems? This is anathema to any big successful vendor. This is the innovator's dilemma.
Yeah.
You're making all your money on a closed system. You think the world may be going towards open architectures, open systems. To make that leap, I've sat at the table looking around at the leadership of a big company saying, should we do this new thing that we found? And you have the kind of renegade executive saying, this is what we ought to do because it's the future. And then you have the people that are paying everyone's salaries making the old stuff. And they're not going to say, great, let's move away from our only source of profit and try something speculative that will have lower margins and will be less influential. That's what Ericsson has to say to truly become an OpenRAN vendor. And for too many companies, they learn as they're going down the drain that they really needed to make that shift. Very few are able to shift. IBM did. They went from mainframes to minis, but they got hammered first. They almost went out of business. They went from minis to PCs. They got hammered again, but they finally made the move and stayed alive. In the telecom equipment sector, it's not clear if Nokia and Ericsson are going to be able to make that shift. But that's a shame because they have such great resources on board, network engineers, designers that few companies have. They could play a critical role in an OpenRAN environment if they do.
Yeah. Well, if they did go out of business too, it's interesting to think where would all those engineers end up the next day? Yeah.
Yeah. Those are the only people. The big carriers no longer have the expertise in-house to design complicated networks. So the equipment vendors that make the stuff have talent, but they can't. If AT&T said, I want to build out a national OpenRAN network, I don't think there's any players that could step up and say, we'll have it done for you by the end of the year.
It'd be impossible.
It'd be impossible. It has to happen piecemeal.
Well, then people don't even agree. Step one is people need to agree on what the ORAN standards are. And even when you have Ericsson stepping up to the plate and saying, all right, this is OpenRAN, we're selling OpenRAN now. Well, across the industry, that's not universally accepted as what those standards are. So really, they're just stepping up and saying, all right, everyone else has to copy us now. They're getting ahead of it. It's, to be cynical about it, it's mostly a branding exercise and a marketing gimmick to go after pots of money that are labeled for ORAN out there, and you're just perpetuating the vendor lock. If I had to put my cynical business hat on.
I think that's a reasonable take on this. Until I see the details of what Ericsson has in mind, you can't say that for sure, but there sure is a mighty strong incentive for them to not really chuck their proprietary Ericsson model and build stuff that anyone could swap out elements, at a moment's notice, item by item, because that takes away their margin, takes away their leverage, and turns the power back over to the carriers. That power has swung back and forth and back and forth. I don't know that it has swung again this time back to the carriers. I think the couple vendors have them locked in pretty good.
Yeah.
And it's going to have to take some real innovation from the OpenRAN players and some open-mindedness from the service providers to make that move.
It seems like, too, a linchpin in all this, because we talk about vendor lock and the hardware. The other piece of it is spectrum. Who owns what radio frequency spectrum and what locations and what they can transmit on. That already, the need to build specific equipment for specific spectrum bands and specific locations, different power levels to avoid signal-to-noise ratio issues, it seems almost impossible without like a software-defined radio unit. They really have an ORAN ecosystem that can meet all those needs effectively. I know we have virtual radio access networks now. We have software-based RAN solutions, but the radio units themselves, that's a huge lift.
It is, and I'm hopeful it's going to happen. I call for it in Wireless Wars, and I'm hopeful that it's going to happen because it turns the power, if nothing else, it turns it from China back to free countries all over the world.
Yeah. Well, we can all agree that that'd be a good thing.
Yep.
Cool. Well, I think we hit a good spot to wrap in this story arc. Happy to keep going, though, if you want to talk about more stuff that you have top of mind. This has been great.
I think we covered all the key issues, and this is still, the story is unfolding as we go. The ending is unclear right now.
John, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a fascinating story. It's an area of geopolitical competition that's not top of mind for most people. It's not in the news, but it's been slowly defining the world that we live in for decades now, and it's certainly going to have ramifications for decades to come.
Yeah, it's, as you know, a subject of great interest to me. And I'm hopeful that the government, working with industry in this country and in countries all over the world, will have a response to give us these trusted networks that we need for everything, not just talking to each other, but running everything that's going on in the world, and that we're able to keep China from flexing its muscle over other countries and exerting influence through its control of telecom equipment.
Awesome. We're all hoping for that. All right, I'll stop the recording. Thank you, everyone, for listening in today. If you liked what you heard, please follow the podcast and share with your friends, and even consider going to the support the show link in the episode description. Thank you, and I'll see you all next time.